Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon to those joining us, and still good morning to those joining us out west. I am Nicole Porter, Senior Director of Advocacy for the Sentencing Project, a research and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., which advocates for effective and humane responses to crime that minimize imprisonment and the criminalization of youth and adults by promoting racial, ethnic, economic, and gender justice. Today, we are hosting a virtual discussion on voting in jails, advocacy strategies to unlock the vote. Let me provide an overview of our conversation this afternoon, and then I'll introduce our panelists. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then my colleague, Durrel, author of the Sentencing Project's recent report titled the same as our conversation today, Voting in Jails, Advocacy Strategies to Unlock the Vote, which can be found online at sentencingproject.org, will provide some opening comments. On the other side of Durrel's comments, we will have a conversation with our panelists and leave time for discussion and Q&A before we wrap up at the top of the hour. Please share comments and questions in the chat. And first, let me start by introducing the panelists. First, it's Durrel who will be up, and he's the Sentencing Project's Jail-Based Voting Initiative organizer. Durrel supports the Sentencing Project's state and local jail-based voting coalitions and initiatives moving the meter on democracy. Durrel is an experienced community organizer, advocate, and activist in the progressive criminal legal reform realm after a 5-year career in corrections, rising to the rank of lieutenant for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. After seeing firsthand the inner workings of the Texas prison system and the impact on those incarcerated and their families, he has devoted his life to creating a world where fewer Black people, poor people, and otherwise disenfranchised people have less of a chance of ending up involved in the justice system in the first place. Next, I'm going to introduce Mr. Joel Castón. Mr. Castón is a fellow with the Justice Policy Institute and a self-published author. His book, Currency Catchers, Investment Curriculum Series, is a one-all book around supporting investment for new investors. He was also elected as an advisory neighborhood commissioner while surviving a life sentence to represent Ward 7 in the Washington, D.C. Ward 7 includes the D.C. jail. And Mr. Castón's single member district also includes the Harriet Tubman's Women's Shelter. Let me also introduce Dr. Nneka Jones-Tapia. Dr. Jones-Tapia is an experienced psychologist who is passionate about mental wellness and criminal legal reform and supporting young people who have experienced trauma. Dr. Jones-Tapia permanently leads the team at Chicago Beyond on justice initiatives, and the organization's newest line of work dedicated to systems level change. Justice initiatives will focus specifically on systems level change and shifting the understanding and narrative around individuals impacted by the justice system. This dedicated line of work will include raising awareness about the impact of incarceration and investing in preventative and early interventions. Dr. Jones-Tapia previously served as the warden of the Cook County Department of Corrections and as a leader at that jail, an institution which has been called the largest mental health hospital in the country, with over 2,000 people who are incarcerated who are diagnosed with a mental illness on any given day. And during her tenure, the Cook County Jail had a polling location that allowed for voting for persons detained there. And so we're going to get into that amongst the various strategies to encourage unlocking the vote and advocacy strategies around voting in jail. We're also going to be joined by Major Phillip Bosquez out of Harris County. The major may join us. I think we're going to get an update on his participation, and when the major does join, we'll welcome him when he comes. But for now, I'm going to kick it over to Durrel, who's going to provide some opening comments on his recent report, which can again be found at the Sentencing Project's website, sentencingproject.org, and the report is on voting in jails. So Durrel.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you everyone who's joining us today. It's the people that are on calls like this that will move the ball down the field when it comes to democracy and all the other issues affecting our society today. So as Nicole pointed out, I'm a former corrections professional, a former lieutenant of correctional officers that's now an advocate and an organizer. And I'm so fulfilled to be able to put a lot of that experience into this report, Unlocking the Vote. So there are basically 6 main ideas. Before going into those ideas, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how I fell into this work and what that looked and felt like, and how it ties into the report as a whole. So after working for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, I got into organizing work and eventually working for the state legislature in Texas, where I began to see how a lot of the issues that I saw on the practical and operation side of the jail and prison system were actually connected to laws that are made, and sort of this disconnect from the general public and elected officials when it comes to corrections as a whole, and how we look at the criminal justice system. So in 2020, towards the general election time, of course, 2020 was a huge election. The Sentencing Project took an even deeper dive into the work of democracy. And in 2020, we were actually able to bring jail-based voting initiatives to some organizations that were working on the issue and to individuals. One of my favorite organizers or favorite stories connected to the work comes out of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where an organizer by the name of Kathy was able to bring voter registration to the Minnehaha jail system there in Sioux Falls. So to take a little bit of a dive into the report itself, it's divided into 6 ideas that would actually unlock the vote. And as Nicole said before, you can find that report at sentencingproject.org. One of the first ideas is expanding voting access in jails, advances racial justice and democracy. When we think of who's typically behind bars, especially in jails for infractions that cause people to be in jail, or that cause people to be in jail without being able to afford bail or bond, it's disproportionately Black people and brown people, right? So expanding this access to those who otherwise would have access to the jail, would have access to the ballot, is huge when it comes to expanding access to democracy. Second, community groups can partner with jail and election officials. In 2018, Houston Justice teamed up with the Harris County Sheriff's Department, and we'll hear from Major Bosquez in a bit. But we also see in Cook County and in other places across the United States where community groups can actually partner with and influence what's happening at jails. The third thing that we talk about in the report is the fact that one person can launch a jail-based voter initiative. I talked a little bit earlier about Miss Kathy. Her last name starts with a B, Brechtelich, I think it is, who started with the idea to bring voter registration to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. She ended up making that happen by reaching out to the right folks, having a plan, and that plan ended up being those voter registration cards being on the library carts that were rolled around the jail. So thinking outside the box can often make this happen. Number 4, jails can be polling locations, and I wish I could change that. Jails should be polling locations, because very often very high concentrations of voters are at jails. And while bail reform is a whole nother conversation, we know that there are high concentrations of people that are in jails every day, some 549,000 people on any given day that don't have access to the ballot just because they're in jail. Number 5, we talk about the fact that jail-based plans can address local voting requirements. So depending on the locality, voting requirements can surface barriers to registration that may seem difficult to overcome in the jail setting. In places like Oklahoma, where access to an absentee ballot can be hindered because it's required that there be a notary public to actually authorize that becomes a barrier when you look at jails. And then number 6, we should encourage jails to host candidate forums. The more candidate forums, the more access to the district attorneys, to the sheriffs, to the judges, and other people that have a say in the justice system, um, should be access to those who are in jail and who would otherwise be able to vote. And with that, I will pass it back to Nicole.
Thank you, Durrel. And before we get into the discussion, so we're going to turn it over to our panelists and we're going to have a conversation rather than just pass the mic and have everyone give a presentation in the way Durrel just did. The major did join us. He did say he was joining us from the field when we had our pre-call last week. I don't think I fully understood what he meant by that, but he's on the phone. Major, can you hear us? And I think we might need to unmute you so that you can weigh in.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had a mix up on the times. I'm en route to video, but I am on the phone now.
Okay, yeah, Major is in Houston, my hometown, so he's an hour behind. So those time differences get us sometimes. I'm going to ask him to go back on mute again. I'm going to introduce him since he'll join us from video, and then when we can get to him, we will. But before I do that, let me just give a brief overview of the major's background. I'm sorry, and then ask for my colleague Morgan or Brianna to go ahead and mute him again since he's still en route. But Major Bosquez commands the 701 San Jacinto Justice Housing Center, one of the 4 bureaus at Criminal Justice Command in Harris County, part of the Harris County jail system. He is also a member of the Texas Commission on Jail Standards, and he joined that state commission in 2013 as one of 4 field inspectors for the entire state, tasked with ensuring that all 239 Texas jail facilities meet requirements. And he's also been engaging directly with Durrel, who does organize with the Sentencing Project, but is also a lead organizer of Houston Justice down in Harris County, Texas, and who have been going to the jail regularly to register folks to vote and to engage in civic participation with folks in the jail. So we're going to welcome the major when he's in his office and available to join us on video. And in the meantime, he's listening and we can reach out to him and connect with him when the opportunity arises. But in the meantime, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Jones Tapia and Joelle and ask you both what your reactions are to Durrel's comments previously and the way in which his briefing paper, his report, frames tools and advocacy strategies to help unlock the vote and guarantee ballot access. So Dr. Jones Tapia, we'll start with you and then we'll go to you, Joelle.
Sure. I want to just highlight one sentence that Durrel said in his commentary, and that's that, and I'm glad you emphasized jails should be polling sites as a matter of public safety. And I apologize in advance. I'm battling a cold, so forgive me if my voice shakes a little, but I've had the pleasure of talking with correctional administrators from all across the country about the daunting task that they have to ensure public safety. And what I have learned is that while I was working in corrections, we were able to make significant reforms and changes because we didn't start with this premise of punishment that the system oftentimes reverts to. And in our conversations with correctional administrators, we've been encouraging them to look beyond the typical, I would say, control mechanisms that we typically see in corrections and consider how they are creating conditions for people in this whole correctional community, and that staff and people incarcerated, to be and feel protected and resilient and whole. And in this mission, we coined this term holistic safety to describe just that. And it's the empowerment of people with lived experience of the system, people directly impacted by the system, to have opportunities to be a part of the change in the system. And it's really about empowerment, and voting is empowerment. By providing a person with the opportunity to vote, we're giving them the ability to control what affects their lives, and emphasizing that their voice is not only, it doesn't just matter in this situation, but it's actually critical to creating the change that we need. And people who vote are engaging productively in community. And when we have more opportunities to add value in our community, we're less likely to engage in behaviors to erode it. So yes, jail should be polling sites, and it is a matter of public safety, and correctional administrators have to be called to the task and rise to the challenge of making sure that people who are incarcerated and their staff have the opportunity to vote.
Wonderful. Joel, do you want to weigh in as well?
Sure. First, I want to thank you, the Sentencing Project, for inviting me today to have me on this panel. And I saw in the chat a number of people from all over the place. You know, I saw Puerto Rico está ahí, right? I saw California, DC. I mean, you have it all over. So I just wanted to acknowledge the people who are watching this webinar right now. So excited to have you here with us. You know what I thought about when Durrel was talking and you spoke about unlocking the vote? The first thing came to my mind is the vote is locked. We think about those disenfranchised, disinvested, and marginalized communities. They are Black and brown, as pointed out earlier in this webinar today. They are the individuals who have been, before they became to prison, unfortunately, they have been trapped out of main society. So when you think about how that, I look at my story as being the first person elected to an office, a public office, while incarcerated. What it proves is that law enforcement, correctional officers, no one have a monopoly on public safety. Public safety is for all people. In fact, I will propose the fact that many people who went on the wrong side of the track, they did so because they were trying to protect themselves, albeit the wrong way. Now what will happen is that when you bring voting inside of prisons, but even before I go there, when you bring voting to these marginalized communities, when you educate them and inform them, what can happen is we can prevent them from committing crimes in the beginning. Reentry is good, but no entry is better. We have to focus on no entry. So we focus on no entry that looks like voter information. It looks like educating the people who need it the most. So when you look at a person like myself being elected, a formerly justly involved person, what it does, it brings hope. It brings hope to the people who say over and over again, why should I vote? What does it matter to me? What change can it bring about? One of my constituents was a young man on the inside. I will conclude on this point here. He said, they asked him, how do you feel now that Commissioner Castón has been elected? He said, the way I feel is because I voted for someone and the person I voted for won. He had a direct connection. When we allow people on the inside to participate on a democratic process and they see their peers elevated, not only elevated in status, but elevated in thought. Now they begin to think like citizens on the inside. That's the goal. We got to get people on the inside who was often not treated like citizens when they were on the outside. Yet we're going about the other way around, right? It seems oxymoronic, but if we always do the same thing, we always get what? The same results. So we want different results. So what happens is that we get people on the inside thinking like citizens before they get released. What it does, it increases public safety. And that's what voting the franchise looks like for incarcerated people.
Thank you so much for your comments, Commissioner Castón. Commissioner Castón, elected from the Washington, D.C. jail while surviving a life sentence. In many ways, your candidacy and your election is revolutionary. I don't know of other candidates. And please, if people do know of other candidates who were elected while incarcerated, please share in the chat so that we can build on all of our awareness. It's a big country, many single member districts across this country. So if anyone knows of any other folks elected while incarcerated, please share that in the chat. But let's stay with you, Commissioner Castón. What impacts civic engagement for people who are incarcerated? In some local jails, and this was mentioned in Durrel's briefing paper, which is the starting point for this conversation, there are some systems that do have active civic education programs. We can speak to that in Cook County, and Dr. Jones Tapia, you might have some additional comments to share. But what impacts civic engagement for people incarcerated? What was your experience through civic engagement while you were incarcerated at the DC jail and in other places of corrections during your prison term?
Wow, thank you. Well, unfortunately, throughout a span of 27 calendar years, I actually served in 16 different facilities. And I would state that DC jail was the first and the only facility that I saw that sort encouraging voter enfranchisement. It speaks to the leadership. It speaks to the policymakers. Those policymakers here in the District of Columbia, DC Council, they thought that it was important to enfranchise the incarcerated people. Not only did they feel that way, returning citizens were the ones who were pounding the pavement. They were the ones going to their council members saying, hey, we got to allow the incarcerated population to vote. So look at that there. The people who are as close to the problems often have the solution, but they're further from the resource to make the change they need. So returning citizens led the charge. Government officials heard and made good on their request. So what it looks like on the inside, I would also have the opportunity to become the founding mentor of the Young Men Emerging program, which we call WAMI inside DC jail. We conducted a sacred circle. And in that circle, we hold weighty conversations. One of the conversations was civic engagement, public safety. And so here we have individuals who were charged with crimes, fighting their crimes, talking about ways they think that they can improve upon their community. Because I think that's what needs to be debunked. You think that people who were formerly justice involved, they do not care about safety. They do. They do. It's just the way they have been going about it may not, it goes afoul against the normal way of doing things, but they definitely care. Our job is to educate them to allow them to do it effectively. So what I saw on the inside was that once the light bulb goes off and people begin to say that, wait a minute, I do care about my mom. I do care about my relatives and my siblings. I do want to be able to have a say-so in what happens in my community because everyone does. Now in the town hall meeting that we have inside the facilities, it takes on a different meaning. Normally when jail officials say town hall meeting, the incarcerated party, oh, because they feel like they don't have a say-so in the matter. They hate it, right? They come around with their pads and everything. Tell me, everybody. And they like, oh, they dread it because they feel like they don't have a voice. It doesn't matter. So at the end, what's important is to let people know that your voice matters. That's what civic engagement is. And when we do that and we give the voiceless a voice, then they want to participate. And it's a win-win for everyone.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jones-Tapia, do you have any additional information to share?
Yeah, what impacts civic engagement? I'll expand on what Brother Joel started talking about, bringing voice. And I kind of chuckled when he mentioned the town halls in jails and prisons. I remember all too frequently, probably towards the beginning of my tenure, walking into living units and saying, okay, everybody to the front, let's talk. And everybody had that same look that Joel gave. But it was only when they felt like someone was actually listening to them. And by listening to them, not just listening, but acting on what they shared and the matters that they raised, did we start to increase engagement. And that to me is civic engagement. It doesn't start with the voting process. I mean, it starts with everyday operations inside of a correctional facility. It starts with everyday operations inside of communities. And so when Joel was talking, I was thinking about how many of the people who have been incarcerated have been pushed into the margins of society. We have excluded them from so many different opportunities. And by instilling civic engagement and the right to vote, whether it's in communities outside of the walls or inside of the walls, we are bringing people back together into society and saying not your voice doesn't just matter, again, but it's critical. And so I just encourage us and everyone who is on this webinar today to think about how we can become a part of that. Like having conversations with people is normal human interactions. Listening and acting on that is civic engagement, and we can all be a part of that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones-Tapia, and welcome, Major Bosquez. Glad to have you here. We're going to get to some more questions, but I also want to encourage everyone who's watching, if you have questions, please share them in the chat and specifically share them in the Q&A window of the webinar so that we can get to your questions easily. We're going to continue in this discussion in reaction to Durrel's briefing paper. report, but we're also gonna engage with you all through the Q&A section. So please put your questions in. Major Bosquez, welcome. Before we get to more of the questions that we had settled on today, I wanted to ask you, you were in the field, so I don't know how much you caught of Durrel's comments, but wanted just to invite you to offer any opening comments that you may have on voting in jails and the work that's happening in Harris County, Houston.
Sure, thank you. I was able to just catch the last few minutes of Durrel's comments. Excuse me. So I would say when we were first approached with this partnership with the Harris County Voting Administration, we thought it was going to be a huge daunting task. So on average, we have about 9,300 inmates incarcerated, sometimes a little bit higher in the last few months. But after the first initial discussions with them and seeing how vital it was, as my two counterparts have already mentioned, bringing that in to incarcerated individuals, we worked through it. And logistically, even in a system this size, the third largest in the country, it wasn't as hard as we thought. We set up a polling location inside of one of the facilities. We're blessed to have a tunnel system. So even though in my building, I only have about 4,300 inmates, my sister jail, which is down the street, has a little bit more than that. We can, since we're connected via a tunnel system, any inmate that wants to come can come to the single polling location. Here in Texas, we also, wherever there's one polling location, you have to have it for the public. So we utilize the lobby. So again, what at first we thought was going to be a huge task, with a little coordination and strong help from the county voting administration, we got it accomplished. And we've had 4 elections, and we're set up for the big election coming in November. And I tell you, I'll share with you a quick testimonial, and then I'll let us get into questions. But after we did the first voting location, or the first election, I should say, we wanted to visit and talk with some of the inmates who had participated. And I talked with one individual, and he shared, and he broke down crying. So his father had been incarcerated in Louisiana. And he said that what he remembers hearing from his father, who was a felon convicted in Louisiana, and they took that right. He said, you know, son, through my actions, I lost that. And those stories stuck with him. So he was incarcerated here in Harris County. And when we started reaching out to the inmate population to make sure that those were eligible, that wanted to do mail-in, and working towards the ones that would be here and be eligible to vote on the day of the election here. And he met that criteria. And he said it was so important because he can remember that voting right stripped away from his father. And by him being able to vote while he's incarcerated for some mistakes that he made, and he took full ownership, it just, he just connected. He could connect back to talking and having those conversations with his father, and it really impacting his father not having the right to vote while he was incarcerated in the prison system. And we a ton of positive feedback from employees who, I think sometimes when we're focused on the inmates who don't have that right, you know, the employees that are here, they're kind of locked in as well. And so we got a lot of positive feedback from employees across the system. So we have several hundred officers and civilian staff that are working here on a given day, and that includes election day. And so we all put it off. Oh, I'll go on election day, and then you're scheduled to work. So we've got a lot of good feedback from the employees who are also being able to exercise that right by us having it here on site at the facilities.
Thank you, sir.
It's doable in a system as big as we are. It's doable. You have to have a great election administration that wants to bring it. But I just tell you, have those discussions, and you can bring it. We brought it to this system, and it's a great partnership.
Thank you so much, Major Bosquez. So again, welcome. We are here talking about voting in jails, advocacy strategies to unlock the vote. I think one of the benefits of this conversation is the diversity of the interest involved. We have the major, who is an active duty, I don't even know what the right term is, but an active duty major at the Harris County Jail. And obviously the culture within a law enforcement facility, a correctional facility, is different from the Sentencing Project. or some of the folks in the audience who are grassroots activists who work with directly impacted communities or are directly impacted themselves and are talking about language and not just expanding the vote, guaranteeing the vote for people who are legally eligible, but for expanding the vote to people in prisons, no matter what their criminal conviction status is, whether or not they're pretrial or sentenced to a life prison term. So there's a range of experiences that are represented amongst the panelists, and there's a range of experiences within the audience. And as we work to challenge mass incarceration and expand the franchise, there's a lot of work for us all to be doing. I just wanted to set some context for this discussion this afternoon, given some of the comments that are happening in the chat. I want to also encourage people to be asking questions, putting those questions in the chat, putting those questions in the Q&A, because we're going to get to them soon. But I have a few more questions for you all. And Durrel, you weigh into as the author. We are in conversation this afternoon with you as the author of the briefing paper, but also with Major Bosquez, Commissioner Castón, and Dr. Jones-Tapia. And so my next question is about implementation. So you all have moved practice forward within the localities that you're residing in Harris County, Houston, in Cook County, Chicago, and in Washington, D.C. And Durrel, you divide your time between Detroit and Houston. So there are active coalitions that are working to guarantee ballot access for people who are legally eligible. Your report speaks to that, Durrel. Our panelists have already spoken to the work that they've been doing around that. Now here's a question about implementation. Once the campaign goal has been won, once a polling location has been established at a county jail, once an expansion or a guarantee of rights have been won within a local correctional institution, what are the next steps needed on implementation to guarantee that the infrastructure is in place to support people while voting in custody, criminal custody? Durrel, we'll start with you, then we'll go to our panelists.
Absolutely. So when thinking about implementation, I have to use both sides of my brain. So today I'm activist, organizer, right? But I have to go back to Lieutenant Douglas, because there was once a day where I was working night shift, where I had, limited staff and this and that. And so some things just got put on the back burner, right? And then there were other things that were prioritized. And so really quick story, I can think of Juma, right? So in the Islamic community on Fridays, they have what's called Juma. I remember being a new lieutenant and not really wanting to put resources toward Juma because I didn't think it was a big deal, right? Let me emphasize that. Me, a staffer, didn't think it was a big deal. So guess what? Juma didn't happen on Friday. Well, Monday, right, after those who were incarcerated organized, and there were some 150 grievances, well, I got some get right? So Juma happened. And I think very similarly, when it comes to access to the ballot, you're going to have some people. I mean, you look at Major Bosquez. Major Bosquez is not there all the time. Sheriff Gonzalez is not there all the time. There's going to be a sergeant on a hallway. There's going to be a lieutenant on a shift who's going to say, yeah, right, we're doing that. It's really important that those who are incarcerated, their family and friends, the organizers and advocates stay on it. You have to make sure that the ball is carried down the field, because if not, we'll cut the cake and have a celebration and it won't get implemented. So that's what I would say from that end.
Wonderful. Dr. Jones-Tapia, you came off mute. Want to go next?
Yeah, I'll add to that and say that it's also important for administrators to engage their staff from the very beginning of the process so that staff are aware of the importance of voting access in jails and the benefit to them. I think Major Bosquez started talking about this, but I think if staff are informed not only of the benefit to the people incarcerated, but to themselves, they're more likely to ensure access. I think the other thing that's needed, and what comes to mind for me, is that correctional administrators have to recognize they can't do the work alone. Once it gets to the point of implementation, they cannot and should not do it alone. So they have to be open to partnering with community advocates. The increase that happened in voting access in Cook County was really due to the partnership and the collaboration between community advocates, corrections professionals, the clerk's office, and the Board of Elections. So I'll share a quick story as well. You know, Cook County Jail, when I was there, they had absentee voting for people incarcerated for years. I thought that was a win because people had access. I never really thought about the benefit of in-person voting, including the increased number of people who would vote with in-person access, until I personally was approached by a community advocate. Michelle Mbekiyani here in Cook County approached me and started talking with me about the benefit, and brought a team of volunteers in to meet with myself as well as the sheriff to share that messaging. And without hesitation, the sheriff said, I'm in. And so understanding that we didn't have to do the work alone, there were partners at the table and hundreds of volunteers, which made a difference. And I'm sure it will make a difference in this world that we're living in now, where most jails and prisons have a staffing shortage. Those hundreds of volunteers made a difference in the ability of more people to be able to access the voting right.
Wonderful. We have some really, this is probably one of the most engaging webinars or virtual discussions I've been on, with all the comments in the chat and the many questions. So I want, Joel and Major Bosquez to weigh in. Then we're going to get to some of the questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Commissioner Castón and then Major Bosquez.
Absolutely, yes. Paradigm shift. We got to have a paradigm shift. That got to precede everything, right? Language is important. Cultural relativism. What happens sometimes, think about this here. I want to speak about my young people in the communities, in the streets, cause and have my young people. They have a term they call ops. Once they label a person an ops, it makes it easy for them to assault that person. If we label law enforcement pigs, it makes it easy for us not to respect them. If we label an incarcerated person an inmate, it makes you easy not to recognize that person right. Now, I can say that because I understand that training is what happens sometimes. I had a privilege webinar people to meet everyone on this panel before we had this webinar today. So I know that Major Bosquez is a good guy. I know that doctor right here, she's an awesome woman. I know that Durrel is a hell of a guy. And I met Nicole Porter when I was wearing oranges. She came inside of the facility I was at when I was currently incarcerated. People don't want to know how much do you know until they know how much you care. I made that statement to let it be known. I believe that these individuals on this panel with me cares, but we come from different walks. The labeling the inmate word that was used, not maliciously, but it's taken a malicious to the individual who hears it. What happens with the staff when you talked about Durrel, that lieutenant didn't understand the cultural relativism of the inmate population or the incarcerated people population, but he saw them as inmates. So it's easy for him for you to be able to say, yeah, that's probably nothing. But for the incarcerated people, Juma is the Holy Grail. You violate that, you violate everything, not just the Muslim population, the Christian population, every other religious group is going to band together because it happened to one of them, it's going to happen to the rest of us next time. So when we begin to see that incarcerated people are people first, John C. Maxwell says everything rises and falls on leadership. But what happens is when you have an excellent leader, but he and she can't always be present. So now we need policy. We have the policy, but with the policy, we have the partnership with the advocacy groups, all hands on deck, the incarcerated people, and the staff working together for a common good. We have a cultural shift. No longer seen as a warehouse, no longer seen as punitive measures, but rehabilitative. If we can make I say this because I don't even want it to be an incarceration system, but the way it is now, we can no longer continue that way. We need an overhaul. The overhaul looks like this here. Reentry starts the first day of incarceration. Rebuilding our community starts the first day of incarceration because I'm putting the focus on incarcerated people. So we having these policies in place from day one. You're already thinking about, are you in franchise? The moment you come to R&D, are you enfranchised? Do you know about this group? Do you know about these programs? See, we're already saying that you need to be programmed. You need help. It's like the sick coming to the hospital. Now, we know that's another topic, how the mental health is going to prison where they should be going to mental institutions. That's another topic by itself. But to keep it here in the implementation, it had to be a partnership. And that partnership is proceeded with labeling and language and seeing each other's as working together for a common good. So what we did in DC jail, what happened was they had an excellent person that was leading the place, but the policy proceeded. The law mandated that now we have an elected official. He should have access to certain things. They gave a point person on the inside that worked in tandem with me. I was an individual who was already thinking about this stuff before I became a commissioner. That's a lot to be said about that there, because there are many smart people on the inside. There are many people on the inside who wants to do better. They just need an opportunity. So kudos to the administrative staff at DC jail. They said they gave me a seat at the table. They gave me a seat at the table. And once I knew how much they cared and other people knew how much they cared, then when they spoke, it's like, oh, that's Ms. Song, that we're gonna listen to, we're gonna let the Deputy Director Patton, because we know she cares, she has a proven track record. And then we bought into the system. So the implementation it can be done, but it has to be an all hands on deck approach. The old African adage still holds true here, right? And seeing everyone as equal partners for the mission.
Thank you so much for Joel. Commissioner Castón, I think many of your comments and the way you frame them offer direct responses to many of the comments in the chat and in the Q&A around language and some of the other perspectives around culture shift and how voting for people in jail opens up jails and opens up correctional facilities to help contribute to that culture shift. Major Bosquez, I wanted to invite you to offer some additional comments, and then we can get into some of the questions offered by the folks in the audience.
Sure. So one of the key components I think that helped us bring in the process into the facility was a robust partnership with the county administration or county elections office. So of course, Sheriff Gonzalez was on board, and with his support, working with the elections administrator, that's what made it possible. We also have 2 or 3, including our departmental chaplaincy group that works the floors to help people get registered. And we kind of broke it up into multiple phases. So working with the elections officials, we wanted to make sure that we pushed out education. So in our facility, we have a lot of kiosks in all the inmate living areas. So we put out voting messages on there. We made forms available to make sure that everybody who wanted to vote via mail had that. They had the dates and when they had to get things by. So as part of our normal mail procedure, they could get the forms. If we had language barriers, we would bring in people that spoke the language to help them fill out the forms, get bilingual forms. We made sure those were picked up daily with the regular mail and to get those in and on time. And if it got close to the deadline, again, working with the elections office, we wanted to make sure we did it all procedurally, but so they could have people come and pick up those things to get them registered in time. A lot of it is about information and getting it to who needs it, which are the residents. So again, we use those kiosks daily. Technology was a big help. We also use technology to sort the roster of the residents who had missed the mail-in deadline, but would still be in the facility on the day of election, and so that they would qualify. So again, technology is very vital, especially when you're dealing with a system that's close to 10,000 residents incarcerated. So that was a key to make it here. And so during my time visiting jails all across the state as an inspector, I get that we're a big animal, and if it can happen here, it should be easier to implement in some smaller facilities. But technology, I think, is the key. And again, those robust partnerships with people, volunteers from the community who want to come in and help do the registration with the residents that are incarcerated, but making sure that they have that information. And I mean, we can all be honest. Sometimes there are some staff that are here just to turn keys. And then we can get those few that want to help rehabilitate and help the residents not come back. And But I really like that we have those kiosks, and I realize that that's not in every facility, but information is the key. And like I've told my family, and I tell people here at work, once you have knowledge, nobody can take it away from you. So getting that information out to the residents, knowing when these deadlines are there, and they have it in where they're living at. But yeah, technology was really the key, and that strong partnership with the elections office here in Houston, the county elections administration. But then again, setting up the polling locations wasn't as daunting. They brought in we had to make a space available with some electric plugs. They set up the polling locations. We brought in a few staff members. I know that there's a nationwide shortage in officers, but we were able to make it happen here. And we get those lists early in the morning. The elections officials are here, and they're opening the polling places just like you do on the street from 7 to 7. And we have inmates lined up at the door, and we schedule them out, and we're bringing them from all over. A 3-building system here with that many inmates. And so I would challenge people to say that it can't be done. Because if it can be done here, if it can be done in DC and Illinois, in the largest systems in the country, it's possible. And but again, those partnerships have to be robust with the elections administration, because they have the dates and outlines, make sure that we're processing these things in time. So somebody doesn't miss a deadline and they don't get the opportunity to vote, which is vital.
Thank you, Major. Appreciate your comments there. So I want to say that for local coalitions working to guarantee voter access for people legally eligible to vote in county jails, and those working to guarantee ballot access, these conversations can get very technical very quick. And there's a lot of process and information that's very specific to the place and the jurisdiction that you're working in. But feel free to reach out to the Sentencing Project, to Durrel specifically, and if there's support that we can have in leading and connecting you to any resources, that's certainly work that we're interested in helping you with. There's been a lot of great questions in the chat. I'm going to start with Jasmine, whose question was endorsed by a renowned historian who's in the audience this afternoon, Alex Uwald. Alex, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name there, but well-known expert on felony disenfranchisement, so folks should check out Alex's work. But to Jasmine's question, what are some points one can bring up when bringing up the importance of their voice? Because a lot of voters in Colorado, so Jasmine's from Colorado, but this is a question relevant for everywhere. A lot of voters from Colorado believe that their voice doesn't make a difference. So, and Commissioner Castón, let's talk with you. I think that this is a problem that many folks run into, even local coalitions working to engage with correctional administrators around jail, voter registration programs, and then ballot access programs might run into participation questions or disengagement questions. So what are some points we can bring up to address the importance of everyone's voice, including incarcerated residents' voice?
Great question. Thank you, Jasmine, for your question. Show them the change will be my answer. Show them the change. I humbly state that my story isn't my story. It's everyone's story. I want politicians, particularly Congress and senators, to see that it's in the best interest of their states to enfranchise people who are behind bars. It is in the best interest of their state to enfranchise people who are behind bars. Me being very vulnerable at this moment, I am a formerly justice-involved person who committed a crime at the age of 18 and was sentenced to life in prison because I took the life of someone else. I am the individual who should, according to how history has been painted and how the news is portrayed, I'm not the type of guy who's supposed to be talking about these things. But if you have someone who was formerly justice involved, who committed one of the most worst crimes on the books as a teenager and been reformed, and who's now actively participating to make my community a better place, that's in the best interest of the state. So the people who are behind bars, howbeit while they are there, they should be given an opportunity to be able to right their wrong through the pathways of civic engagement. It's in the best interest. Show them the change. That would be my response to you, Jasmine. Show them the change. Let them see someone like a Durrel Castón. It's not about me, it's about others. It's about the change that can be produced, that can be brought about if we enfranchise the individual who was once on the wrong side of tracks, who are trying to desperately get on the right side of track and remain on that train. That's what I would say. Show them the change.
Great. Does any of the panelists want to weigh in? How can we encourage that people's voices will be heard if they participate in the vote?
I think talking about the benefit of voting, not just from their voice being heard, but just the actual act of voting as having some benefit. You know, I'm a psychologist, so I'm gonna put my psychologist hat on for a second. Even if a person voting doesn't get the outcome that he or she wants in the election, the act of making your opinion known is psychologically rewarding. And so I think, you know, putting that in language that people will buy into is one way. I think Joelle made a very good point that I want to just emphasize here is the power of credible messengers and having people who have been incarcerated coming back into the facility as a part of the voting drives, voting registration drives, to talk about the benefit of the civic engagement process will help to encourage people to want to be involved. And then the last thing I will offer is there were countless people I encountered in my time working in corrections. And no matter what a person had done, what they were charged with, every last one of them cared about someone on the outside of that facility. And if you link their voice in the election, in the voting process, with what can happen for their loved one who is outside of that facility, I guarantee it will increase the number of people who want to engage because they want a better life for the people who they care about, if not just for themselves.
Thank you for that. So helpful to think about. Durrel, you had raised your hand, but then we're going to go to Major Bosquez and then to another question. Go ahead, Durrel.
Absolutely. So I would point to instances like in Genesee County, Michigan, where Tony Gant and the folks over at Nation Outside and Safe and Just Michigan were able to take formerly justice-involved citizens back into the jail, and they were able to see 80% plus turnout based on those conversations that were had. And then the other point that I would make, two more points. One, I think even in places where universal suffrage doesn't exist, or access to the ballot, even for those in prison, doesn't exist, to encourage like those conversations to happen, even with those family members and friends that are on the outside, to really point to how this voting actually impacts the kitchen table. Because to be honest, when you look at your ballot, especially in places like Harris County, where it's like an encyclopedia, you may know, who you want to vote for president or governor or U.S. senator or Congress. But when you get down into the legislature and the DA and all of this stuff, it's not as clear cut. So I think having a lot of those conversations that aren't in legalese, I've seen a lot of voter guides that read like the King James version of the Bible, right? We got to knock it down to where it is actual conversational, because there's a whole lot that's missing in the conversation.
Thank you. Major Bosquez, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think those are all great points, not to be legal to the point. But yeah, the voter education. So when we see some of the groups come in, we have officers go along with them, and not just for the escort, but I'm like, hey, try to pick up some of that information. So if you have an opportunity, if a resident comes to you after the group is left, you may be able to provide that voter education and at a level that they would understand. So just like Durrel said, maybe their education level is lower. So yeah, when you look at some of the brochures or information that puts out, you have to have a political science degree. But if we can tell you, oh, what area are you from? Hey, these are the candidates that are in your area. Maybe when you talk to your wife tonight, maybe she's got some input. But voter education is the key.
Thank you. So listen, everybody, this has been one of the most engaging virtual discussions that the Sentencing Project has hosted And my evidence for that is all of these questions that we are not going to get a chance to go to, and all these comments in the chat that we are not going to get a chance to go to. But what I'm going to say is this. Durrel is provided a link in the chat that if people want to stay in conversation with the Sentencing Project around this, please fill out the form and we'll be in touch with you. I do have 2 questions that I want to get to you by by some of the best formerly incarcerated activists I know who are out there doing the work. One is from Lauren in Texas, who has a question for you, Major Bosquez. I'm going to ask this question to Lauren because I know her and I know her work is great. And she asked you, Major Bosquez, can you commit to working with stakeholders to holding a candidate forum inside of the Harris County Jail ahead of the next mayoral election? That's a recommendation that Durrel offers in his briefing paper that the Sentencing Project published. And there's a request from Texas. Lauren is doing work with the Texas ACLU. She's posing a question to you specifically if Harris County can hold a candidates forum in the Harris County Jail ahead of the next mayoral race. Is that something that you can work with Lauren on?
I would be open, of course, to open with their. I have to get some people above me, but we have speakers come in, so you know, I think we could find a space. I would definitely have to get the sheriff and the chiefs to buy in on it, and but yeah, I mean, we have speakers, so I think logistically, if we have them in one location, can we broadcast that throughout the system on our TV? So if they want to tune in and be involved, yeah.
Lauren has a response in the chat. She's saying, woohoo. So I can feel it from Texas. Durrel, I want to say that your form the permissions need to be changed on it. People are saying they can't access it. So if you can fix that while we're still on and people can fill out the form or have access to it, that'd be great. My last question before we wrap up the call is from a formerly incarcerated DC resident, Anthony Pete Petty, who's going to join the Sentencing Project in conversation at the end of the month. I'm going to mention that before we wrap up. But Pete's question is, as a formerly incarcerated individual, I have seen how staff at facilities will not pass out voting information received, including the actual ballot. Pete is from DC, and while incarcerated, observed people sentenced to felonies and in the local jail being able to vote while incarcerated. And so Pete's question is, particularly, what insurance do the men and women have that their voice is being heard, particularly as we work to expand the vote to people who are eligible while in criminal custody? So we'll start with you, Dr. Jones Tapia, then go around, and then I'll have some concluding comments on the other side of y'all's reactions to Pete's question.
Yeah, Pete's question, I mean, really speaks to the reality that staff are the gatekeepers to this process. And that's why they have to be involved in this partnership from the very beginning, to not only educate them on the benefit, again, to people incarcerated, but to themselves, and to know that there is a process in place that they are a part of. They are a part of someone improving their community, and that's what their work is supposed to be about. What I have heard from correctional staff from across the country is that they want to be a part of something higher. They want a higher purpose. And so educating them on their role in this higher purpose, I think will help to increase their commitment to this process. And the last thing I'll say is, again, not just starting with the voting process with engagement with staff, with people incarcerated, administrators and people incarcerated and staff needing to come together long before the voting process to partner on different things around the institution to help increase the buy-in by the time we get to the election process.
Great. Commissioner Castón, did you have any reactions to Pete's question?
Yes, compassionate corrections. Compassionate corrections. I don't just uplift the voices of incarcerated people, but all people need to be, everyone's humanity needs to be recognized. When I think about corrections also, I think that the dignity of corrections need to be restored. So sometimes corrections officers, they don't even think that they're doing a noble task. It is a noble task they're doing as corrections officers. If we can put compassionate corrections into corrections, then they can change the way they think. And then once they change the way they think, then they change the way they behave and the way they act. So Pete, that was a great question. When it's this about Pete, I know Pete, we work together. He's an awesome guy. That's my friend. I'm glad he's going to Sentencing Project. If I heard you correctly, whatever the relationship is, I just want to endorse it because he's an awesome person. He and I, while serving life sentences as juveniles, we both were passionate about voting. this before I was a commissioner. We were just excited. A lot of this misnomer real fast. A lot of misnomer that most people don't think that incarcerated people are even concerned about the news and everything. Pete is an avid politician. Yes, this should be his title. He and I, we put together a podcast to educate our fellow incarcerated peers about the importance of voting. If we can put that compassionate corrections, we can restore the dignity of correctional officers, humanize incarcerated people, I call them people, residents, etc. Everyone would see it, it'd come together, it'd build a community. My last point is here. I want the Congress and the senators to know it's in your best interest to enfranchise the incarcerated population. Reach out to us. Get answers from the experts to help you implement that in your state.
Thank you, Major Bosquez. Then your wrapped up, your concluding comments, Durrel.
I would just say, excuse me, I'll borrow a line that my sheriff has been using here recently as we're redesigning a women's facility we want to bring online. And it's, I would question if there are people in the community that think we're not on the right track. I would leave them with this question or this statement. How do they want us to return their neighbors? Because God willing, these people, these residents, they're not going to be with us forever, and they shouldn't be. And they're going back out in the communities. So if we can offer them voting rights, these staples that our country was built on, and give them that why they are spending time with us, we're going to return better neighbors to these communities. And I think that that's what we need to do. And I'll leave it short. I know we're running on time, but how do they want us to return their neighbors? So.
Thank you so much, Major and Durrel.
Absolutely. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. And I want to do a call to action. Let this not be your last step. If you join this webinar, if you've put comments in, if you've got a motor that's running, let this not be the last step that you just attended this webinar. So that means hopping onto that form that's in the chat and adding your name to join our monthly calls where there's a national conversation that happens every month, or reaching out to someone locally in your community to move the ball down the field for democracy where you live.
Thank you. Thank you all. This is an amazing webinar. Again, one of the most engaging ones I've ever participated in. So I really thank you all for your time and the work. And Durrel, thank you for the leadership you've been guiding the Sentencing Project with. Let me say this is not the end of this conversation. I mean, we're in voting season, folks. So in a couple of weeks, the Sentencing Project is actually going to co-host another webinar that is in your inboxes already. We're going to co-host it with the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. We're going to continue to build on the conversation on expanding voting rights and rights restoration work that's happening around the country. And Pete Petty, Joel Castón's friend, who was engaging in work long before he got his right to vote as an incarcerated resident from DC, is going to be on that webinar. So join us in a few weeks and listen to Pete and listen to the others, including Representative Tara Simmons from Washington State, who's going to join that webinar. She's a formerly incarcerated state rep who got voting rights restoration legislation through the Washington Assembly. So join us in a couple of weeks to listen to Pete and listen to Representative Simmons. Thank you all for your time. This is a part of the Sentencing Project's work. We focused on jail-based voting today, but we are also focusing on expanding the voting rights to everyone, and that people should never lose their voting rights once they get them, including people who are sentenced to prison. So continue to work with the Sentencing Project on that, continue to join in these conversations. And as you heard from the panelists and Durrel's call to action in particular, connect with us on next steps. So thank everybody for their time. We're going to close out, but we are going to continue the conversation and continue the fight for voting rights. So thank you all.